In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. The intro to John really lets you know that we're talking about something different. Think about the way that the synoptics start. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They start telling you a very human story about this person, this teacher named Jesus, and what's going on. John has a completely different starting point. If you think of kind of the assumption we've had throughout this class is that Mark was written first, Matthew and Luke probably come sometime later, and John probably comes at the end. And this is helpful, particularly in this way, because Mark really starts his gospel at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Jesus is an adult and he's on the scene. Matthew and Luke both take a step back and say, well, let's not just talk about his ministry. Where did Jesus come from? And both of them take a step back to say, this is the miraculous events surrounding Jesus' birth, right? That there are angels and there's prophecies being fulfilled and all of these excellent things. Jesus is a little bit more than just this itinerant preacher who popped up on the scene when he turned 30. John takes it even further back to say it's not just that he was born as a baby and miraculous things surrounded his birth. John is taking it even further and saying, no, what's happening in Jesus is universal in scale. What's happening here has been in the works since the beginning of time. In fact, the person who's going to be on the scene for the rest of the book is the person who is making the whole world, the person who did create and continues to create everything, the person who is somehow with God and also God at the same time, whatever that means. John throws you in to a whole different world and is saying, no, now that we've seen Jesus, the way John says it, he says, we have seen his glory, the glory as of a father's only son, full of grace and truth. Because we've seen Jesus' glory, it changes the way that we understand everything in the world. Our whole understanding of existence, of the cosmos, has shifted now. Good? Okay. So for today, we really need to cover our background stuff that we've kind of been doing the same thing for all the other lectures. John, I'm going to say this a lot. John is confusing. John both gives you a lot of answers, which is great. But every time he gives you answers, it also raises more questions. Not as great. And John does this and doesn't really resolve to help you with it. So we need to, the same way we did with the other texts, we need to look at what the text says and what freedoms we have to interpret or reinterpret kind of our church history stuff around it. John is very controversial in terms of its authorship and its dating and its provenance and all these sorts of things. It's also, as we're going to see, controversial in the way that it talks about Jesus, the way that it talks about Jesus' opponents, all of these ways that John operates. It's going to be difficult for us to navigate. That's why I really like John. We talked at the very beginning about how you can read all of these texts on two levels. The level of what's going on with Jesus and his interlocutors, the people he's talking to, as well as the level of like the gospel author, what's happening for Matthew and his community. Maybe he's telling this story about Jesus, but he's really talking about the destruction of the temple years later or something like that. John does this for sure. He's talking about Jesus and also talking about his own time. But John also has other layers, or by that I mean he's using multiple layers in different categories. So one example is if I meet somebody who just became a believer and they say, what book of the Bible should I read? I would say John. It's accessible and it's easy and it's clear and you kind of know what it's talking about. It's an entry level, easy text to read at this level. At the same time, people who have read through their Bible and they've been Christians for years and they're kind of stale, everything is stagnant, I've read it all before, I would tell them, you should go and read John. Because even though on the surface level it's very accessible and easy to understand and interpret, if you dig down into it, it has hidden meaning and hidden truths and levels of depth that I would argue the other Gospels don't have, where it's easily approachable on one level, but if you offer it more of your time and more of your mind, it will give you more. Good? Okay. I'm going to say John, even though there's debate about the actual authorship. We're just going to say John for the sake of clarity. But this is highly debated. The gospel is anonymous, just like all the other texts are. But the gospel gives us a character that it gives us a little more to latch onto than the synoptics do. Starting in John 13, you have this character who pops up called the beloved disciple. And nobody has any idea who this guy is. He is supposedly at the Last Supper, according to John, and he is reclining next to Jesus at the Last Supper. We call him the beloved disciple. In Greek, that's a fine translation. It's like the disciple whom Jesus loved, which, I mean, if you're another disciple, that kind of stings, right? That he's the one who's called the disciple whom Jesus loved and not everybody else. He pops up in chapter 13, and we see him throughout the rest of the text. Notice that he doesn't arrive until halfway through the gospel. He doesn't arrive until after Jesus has arrived in Jerusalem for the last time. Maybe it's because he's a Jerusalem-based disciple. He's not Galilean, maybe. The text doesn't tell us who he is, but if you look at the very end of John, it tells you that he's the one relaying the information that's recorded in the text. So this is John 21, starting in 24. This is the disciple, the beloved disciple, who is testifying to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true. Okay, so there's two things here. It says, where's my pen? It says that the BD has written and testifies. Okay, so he has written these things and he testifies about them. But also, who else does it talk about in that verse in 21:24? There's a pesky little pronoun in the verse that kind of throws the authorship into question. What's the pronoun? We. Who's we? Right? So this is a group of people who are not the beloved disciple that are writing and testifying about the truth of the beloved disciple's claims. Right? So people are very quick to say, oh, it's John, the son of Zebedee. He's the author of the text and he wrote it all down. I don't know that the text gives us that easy of an answer. Even if you argue that the beloved disciple is John, the brother of James, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12 disciples from Galilee, and people make this argument, that does not help you to identify who this is. It makes it very difficult. And there are a lot of scholarly guesses about what's going on here. And I don't know that any of them are more helpful or less helpful than any others. So at the same time, while the text is giving us more and saying the stories that you read come from this person, it also makes you ask a lot of questions. Well, who's the person? And who is it that's telling us the stories about the person? The way that I understand it, no matter who the beloved disciple is, in my imagining, he is an early disciple of Jesus. Whether he's John, the son of Zebedee, or a prevalent argument now, especially from Richard Bauckham. I've got a book of his somewhere behind me. It's called The Testimony of the Beloved Disciple. But he argues the beloved disciple is actually a different John, John the Elder, who's a central pillar in the Jerusalem Christian church. Different guy, still named John. He's a great early eyewitness, but not one of the 12. Either way, the beloved disciple establishes a church somewhere after Jesus dies. Traditionally, we would say it's Ephesus. He establishes a church and he preaches for years about Jesus. And he recounts all of these things that he experienced while he was a disciple. And he said, and he tells these stories. There was this time where we were all out and listening to Jesus and everybody got hungry. So Jesus told us to take this kid's lunch. And so we did. And Jesus just kept pulling food out of the basket and it never ran out. And he fed thousands of us with this one kid's, lunchbox. And there was another time where we were with Jesus and he sent us off to get some food. And when we came back, he was talking to this woman who was a Samaritan. And she seemed like she was believing and understanding. And none of us really knew what was going on. But she ran off and a whole town in Samaria believed in Jesus because of this conversation that he had with her. And so he tells these stories every Sunday, encouraging his own community. Okay, for years, people come in, people become Christians and come to listen to his testimony about Jesus. And then he dies. Now, what would you as a community want to do if this pillar of your church, who has been telling you these stories for years, suddenly dies? Or maybe it's not suddenly, maybe he's super old, right? When he dies, you as a community would have an impulse to write down the testimony that he has been teaching you for years. So maybe the Gospel of John is a product of this community, what we would call, what scholars now call the Johannine community. Maybe they get together and say, we need to write a book. We need to write down all of these stories so that 10 years from now, if somebody comes to join our church, we can explain to them why we're here. We can explain to them who it was that established us as a church and how he taught us about Jesus. I like this idea. It seems very organic to me. It seems very a normal thing to happen in the life of a church. Right? People do this today with scholars and with pastors where they will write a, what's it called in German? A Festschrift when a scholar dies. So if a prominent scholar dies, all of his former New Testament students will write a paper and they'll publish a book that's a collection of essays of that scholar's students all talking about, hey, here's this argument that has to do with this. And the reason I can make this argument is because my professor taught me this and this. And so there's scholarly articles arguing something new, but they're also about this one person who just died. We still do this sort of stuff today, writing in order to commemorate the effect that someone had on our lives. Perhaps this is the case. Some people don't like this as much because they view it as more removed or as it's not really an eyewitness account if it's like the disciples of the beloved disciple that are recording this. I don't know that I really buy that. In the same way that the testimony, the gospel according to Mark, is not necessarily because he's a firsthand eyewitness. It's his version of the story. It's the testimony, the gospel according to his method of telling the gospel. And that's exactly what this is. These other people are recording the gospel in a way that the beloved disciple used to teach it. Good on this? There are a lot of arguments about this, about not just who the guy is, but also how the book actually comes to be formed. So for the beloved disciple in particular, obviously the most historic argument is that it's John, the son of Zebedee. So this is one of the 12. He's a fisherman from Galilee. He's the brother of James, and he is one of the top 3 disciples. It's Peter, James, and John, right? Scholars now point to this being problematic for 2 reasons. One, he is very clearly Galilean, this John, and the beloved disciple really seems to be Jerusalem-based. He really only pops up in the story in John 13 and following. He's not part of any Galilean stories. He's not at the wedding at Cana. He's not at the conversation with Nicodemus. He's not at the feeding of the 5,000 or the walking on water or any of those sort of stories that we're familiar with. And the other thing is, how familiar with Jerusalem would a Galilean fisherman be? The text seems to know a lot of geographical details about Jerusalem itself. There's this gate, and it's on the eastern side of Jerusalem, and people go in for this and this reason. And there's this pool, and it's over by this gate, and people gather at the pool for this reason. He seems to know more details about Jerusalem than he should if he's not a local. The other argument has to do with he's a Galilean fisherman, John is, and would a Galilean fisherman be able to write at this level of interaction, this level of Greek? Now, to be fair, John's Greek is very basic. If you're going to learn Greek, you learn John in Greek first. It's way easier to read than, say, Luke or Hebrews. But scholars question if a Galilean fisherman could have produced this text, even after years and years of study and church leadership and whatever else. We don't know. The more popular option now is another guy named John the Elder. That's who we talked about, who's a Jerusalem-based disciple. He's an eyewitness. He's an early disciple of Jesus. He's been there from the beginning, but he's not one of the 12. And that is a key distinction to explain why he's not named in the text. And then from here, people have made arguments in the last 50 years for various people, and none of them have really had much success. Some popular ones are Lazarus. I like this one. I find this very interesting. Where is Lazarus from? Right. He's from Bethany, which is like less than a mile outside of Jerusalem. We talked about this in a previous class. When Judas betrays Jesus, he betrays Jesus's location because the authorities don't know where to find him at night, so they can arrest him in secret. Where he's staying at night is Bethany. So he withdraws from Jerusalem and hides in Bethany every night for Passover week, until he goes to Gethsemane and Judas tells them where he's going. But Bethany is close enough to Jerusalem. People come and go. It's like a suburb. People can live in Bethany and work in Jerusalem. And Lazarus is from Bethany. So he is certainly close enough to Jerusalem to be important. And he's certainly well known, well described in the text, because he's the one who dies and comes back to life. In the Gospel of John, the raising of Lazarus is the reason that the authorities want to kill Jesus. Lazarus comes on the scene, he dies in John 11, and the beloved disciple comes on the scene in 13. Maybe it's very much like a conversion experience. I was Lazarus, that was my name, and then I died. And when I was reborn, I'm identifying myself as the beloved disciple instead. Who knows? Another argument that scholars have made, I don't know that it's gotten much traction in the scholarship, is that it's Mary Magdalene. This kind of teases out the beloved disciple thing probably a little too far. If you read like the Gospel according to Mary Magdalene, which is like a later Gnostic text, it talks about how Jesus loved Mary more than the other disciples and used to kiss her. The Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown like ran away with this and made a whole thing about Jesus and Mary Magdalene having a child. But if it's Mary Magdalene calling herself the disciple that Jesus loved, that might have different implications. I don't know. But the scholarly argument is that the testimony of a woman might not have as much authority, and so she disguises herself as the beloved disciple in order for her testimony to be able to be accepted. I don't know that I like that, just because the early church probably wouldn't have accepted anonymous testimony, right? They would want apostolic authority. Hey, this testimony comes from this person and we know who it is. And I think the early church would have rather had a testimony from Mary Magdalene, who they knew, they certainly know her name, rather than an anonymous testimony. Even if like outsiders wouldn't value it as much, I don't know that insiders would value an anonymous text. Go ahead, Carrie. Yes. Lazarus is the only other person in John who's identified individually as someone Jesus loves. Yes, it's a very appealing idea. I really like it. I don't know that it's true, but I really like it. I think it's very interesting. I tend to, at least for like scholarly purposes, point to John the Elder, some eyewitness that's not one of the 12, not John the son of Zebedee. And again, because the text doesn't tell us who it is, it's kind of okay to either say we don't know or to disagree with like the church history. I think the way I understand the history, the Gospel of John is more early. It's how to say this. It's debated more early than the other gospel texts are. So like we talk about Eusebius, who records Papias, writing about who's the author. And Papias says, well, Matthew wrote Matthew and Mark wrote Mark, etc. But even early on, in the first couple centuries, there are people saying it's not John the son of Zebedee. I think it's Tertullian who comes out and says it's John the Elder, a Jerusalem-based disciple who wrote the gospel. And there's a lot of debate about this very early. It's unclear. So this is kind of one aspect of the authorship, is who is the beloved disciple, which is the source of the testimony. The other aspect of authorship that's up for debate is part of like, how do we get from the testimony of the beloved disciple to actually having the Gospel of John? What is the process to get from oral testimony to a written gospel? Obviously, the easiest way to understand this is the beloved disciple sat down and wrote the Gospel of John. That's the easy way to understand it. And it's certainly possible. It is very possible to say John the son of Zebedee or John the Elder or Lazarus or whoever the beloved disciple is sat down near the end of his life and recorded a version of his testimony for his own congregation. Okay? Very easy to understand. The other version is kind of what I described earlier. His church gets together and writes his testimony after his death. That's why you get the weird little saying, about at the very end of 21, in 21:23, a rumor spread in the community that the beloved disciple would not die. And the text takes the time to explain there's this rumor that he wouldn't die, but that's not actually what Jesus said. Jesus just said instead that it's my will that he remains until I come. What does that have to do with you? That it's not up to Peter, doesn't have the right to know how John is going to die. Why would the text include this? Well, the scholarly argument is it's because he just died. And there were rumors that he wasn't going to die until Jesus comes back. Jesus isn't back. The beloved disciple is dead. Everything is a lie. And so maybe they're producing this text and including that verse to say, no, that's not actually what Jesus said. Right? And it's in response to his death. Who knows? The other argument, which is very popular now, has to do with what I wrote down a minute ago with the Johannine community. That maybe this text comes up out of this community as a way for them to understand themselves over and against two different groups of people. One is other Christians. I'll just put across. And two is non-Christian Jews. Maybe the community, the Johannine community, needs a way to clearly identify themselves and their own identity markers. They need an established authoritative text that separates them from, say, Petrine Christians who follow Peter's testimony, or Thomasine Christians who follow Thomas. But maybe they also need a way to distinguish themselves from Jews in their local community who do not accept Christ. Because if you remember, up until 70 at least, all Christians consider themselves Jews. Even Gentile converts would say, I'm a convert into Judaism through this Messiah. It's the Jewish Messiah. So I'm practicing a Jewish religion. The argument that scholars will make about this Johannine community is essentially that there is some sort of rift between these non-Christian Jews and the Johannine community. Essentially, what they'll argue is the Christian followers are expelled from the synagogue, and they are told, you are no longer allowed to practice with us. And so this is a crisis of identity for them, and now they need to form their own community, and they do so centered around this text and this testimony. Okay? This has been a popular idea for 80 years, 70 years. It has gotten pushed back in the last 20 years, particularly because they're not really sure that there would have been any authoritative expulsion of Christians early enough for it to matter. I think in the year 95 or 100, supposedly, Jews add what's it called? It's a condemnation of heretics, essentially, to their weekly creed. So on Saturdays, they get up and say the Shema together, but supposedly they add a condemnation. God, please curse the heretics who believe the Messiah has come. Now, when you do this, there's a specific reason you do it, and it's to weed out the Christians. But there's a lot of debate about if this really happens in the first century and if John is really a text written after this happens. It's very unclear historically at what point this happens. We know that curse happens by the 4th century, right? But that's way too late. We don't know how early it's actually put into liturgical practice for 1st century Jews. Good on this? All of this to say, it is very opaque. It's very difficult to understand or to get a clear grasp on where this text is coming from. So, for me, it comes back to, it claims itself to be eyewitness testimony, that it comes from the beloved disciple. And that's enough for me to say, all right, so all we need to do is read the text. We don't need to come up with a community or a person or an identity in order to interpret the text. because we don't have that available to us. All we really have in front of us is this text. My problem with a lot of this stuff, and I think we've seen this before, is that it becomes very circular. If you are inventing this Johannine community and then interpreting the text based on these supposed historical disagreements between Jews and Christians, that becomes problematic, because now you're going to turn around and interpret certain verses in the Bible based on this invented history. And I don't really like that. Good?